You know, I am not generally a patient man. No, I know. It shocks some of you to hear me say that. I think I'm better than I used to be. I'm way better than Bruce Utley. Is Bruce even in here right now? Way better than Bruce. But I still kind of tend to be an impatient person. I think I also tend to be kind of impatient with regard to healing. You know, I had a battery problem in my car on Friday, and I ended up being stranded up here at the AutoZone because I broke a battery cable connector thing, and I was bleeding all over the place. And the people at AutoZone are really glad to help you until you start dripping blood, and then it's kind of like, well, you know, good luck with all of that, and we'll be inside, and I don't blame them. I understand all that. I finally got it fixed, but now this thing is really hurt, and it's healing, and it's even, you know, I have a little scab or something, and sometimes I have a hard time just leaving it alone. You like that? You get a scab, and I have a hard time sometimes just allowing it to have the time to heal. And though I kind of hate to admit it, the same thing is true of the kinds of hurts that we've been talking about this month, the emotional things, the internal things, the things in my past, the things where someone hurt me, where they did something, where they didn't do something, where they said something. I have a tendency to kind of rehearse those things in my mind and kind of go back and I don't know if I try not to hold a grudge, but just to kind of to dwell and to kind of be there over and over again. And that's why we're spending the month of June. And I planned this, literally months ago, planned to deal with this month. We've been talking about healing these hurts that we don't deserve. And we started in the first Sunday in June in John chapter 5, talking about the healing choice, that Jesus talks to this man at the pool of Bethesda and says, do you want to get well? And you got to make that decision. You got to decide you're going to move in a more positive direction or try to move in a healing direction. And then in John chapter 11, we talked about the healing power from the story of the raising of Lazarus in John 11:35. Remember that? Jesus wept. And we talked about the power of comfort, of God comforting us, and that us then taking that comfort and comforting other people and trying to be open to allow people to comfort us. Last week from Matthew chapter 18, we talked about the path of healing, where we talked about forgiveness. Because we're all going to have to forgive if people have hurt us and if things have happened to us. We're going to have to forgive those things. And this morning, I want to turn to the Gospel of Luke, and I want us to talk about the healing process. Now, before I do that, let me say this. My plan months ago was to do 4 lessons and to do this during the month of June, to move on to something else in July because that's what I was going to do. But I have been confronted with some things in my own life. And I know that some of you have been confronted with some things in your lives that makes me want to do just one more sermon in this series. And I'm going to do it next Sunday, and it's called The Healing Prayer. And I'm going to preach from Psalm 77. And I encourage you to go to Psalm 77 between now and next week, and I encourage you to spend some devotional time there. Because here's the thing, what Psalm 77 focuses on and talks about is what happens when you're mad at God. Can you be mad at God? Do we have to sometimes forgive God? And this psalm focuses us in that direction. And so I think this is crucial, that we spend some time talking about the relationship that we have with God in the midst of some of the downright dreadful hurts that we experience in life. That's next week. Come back. Now, today, we're going to talk about the healing process from Luke chapter 17. I want you to look at Luke 17, verses 11 and 12. This is what Luke records. It says, on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. As he was going into the village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. So Jesus, let's just start off and understand the distances here. Jesus is making a journey of about 70 miles from Galilee to Jerusalem. It'd be about like us walking from Austin down here to San Antonio, south of San Antonio, on foot, and he's on foot. And he's kind of skirting the border of Samaria and Galilee, and possibly going across the Jordan River and coming down the other side in an area called Perea. It'd be kind of like us, not walking down the west side of I-10, or I-35, but we walk down the east side. But he's somewhere in the boundary between Samaria and Galilee. And of course, Samaria was known as the place of the half-breeds and the place of the people who weren't really God's people, and that God didn't really love them. And they were the half-breeds. They were these people that God didn't care about. And it says that as he approached the village, he came across this group of lepers outside the city. So here we have, in a region of outcasts, we have Jesus come across a group of men, 10 men, who are themselves also outcasts. They're outside the city because they have leprosy. We'll come back to that in just a moment. And then verses 12 and 13 says, they stood at a distance because they had leprosy. And that's what the law required. That's what society required. You couldn't get close to people because of what leprosy was. So they called out in a loud voice, Jesus, Master, have pity on us. Now they called him by name. How did they know that this was Jesus? How could they possibly know that this was? Well, Luke doesn't tell us, right? And maybe it was that they had heard about Jesus, and Jonathan, who did such a great job with communion thoughts today, maybe they had heard about some of the hundreds of miracles that Jesus performed. So many miracles that the books of the world couldn't contain them. So maybe they'd heard about this famous rabbi who was traveling around, and he was an itinerant preacher, and he was healing people and doing amazing things for them. Or maybe they recognized him, or maybe the news of his approach had already reached them in the village. So we don't really know. But in any case, when they saw him, they knew he was a man of compassion. And if you know anything about leprosy, you know what a disfiguring disease it was. And so they kind of pushed themselves up on their rotting hands, and they kind of tried to stand up as well as they could on their decaying feet. And they raised their voices as loud as their strength would allow them to do so. And they called out to him. And Jesus, as he had done many times before, stopped. And Jesus always seems to do this, doesn't he? Especially to the people on the margins of a culture, of society, the outcasts, the poor, the sinners, the people who were rejected, the people who were kept at arm's length, the half-breeds, the people that are the alien crowding at the border. I mean, all of these people that good people, holy people didn't want to have anything to do with. Jesus was the one who was walking right into the midst of them and drawing them close and healing their illnesses and showing them that he cared about them. And so he looked at these 10 men, and what he saw was these guys huddled together outside the city, and he saw these 10 wretched, forsaken, miserable men. I mean, leprosy was a gruesome disease. Again, your appendages, your fingers, your nose, your toes, your feet, they rotted away because they didn't know how to treat it. We know how to treat it today. You treat it with antibiotics, and leprosy is basically gone in modern day times, but they didn't know what to do with it back then. So all they knew to do was to isolate these guys and put these guys outside the city and away from polite culture, so that they wouldn't get everybody else sick and everybody wouldn't come down with leprosy and then everybody'd die. And so Jesus knew that this was a desperate, passionate cry for help and for healing. And I want to suggest to you this morning that there are some parallels here between what happened next and the healing process through which we all must move. Now, I'm assuming some things. I'm assuming I'm assuming that you've at some point been hurt. I'm assuming that at some point someone has hurt you and hurt you powerfully. I mean significantly, horribly. And maybe it was your parents. I don't know. Maybe your parents abused you, or maybe it was maybe one of your children has rejected you, or maybe it's a spouse who turned their back on you or cheated on you, or maybe it's the fact that you had a boss that treated you terribly, or there's something going on. Maybe there was a preacher or a pastor or an elder at some point in your life in the church that treated you badly and said horrible things to you. Things that now you know just simply aren't true. And I'll tell you, to be honest with you, I talk to people like that almost. Is it too much to say almost every week? Almost every week. I talk to people who say, yeah, so-and-so back there and did this, and they said this, and they did that. And all I can say to them, and they're church leaders that do this, and all I can say to them is, I'm sorry. So I'm assuming you've been hurt somewhere along the way. Friend betrayed you, something. And I'm assuming that you've kind of been working through this stuff together here in the month of June, and you've kind of understood the healing choice, and so I want to get well. I'm going to make that decision to get better, and you understand the power of comfort, and you've opened yourself to God and to God's people working in your life. You're walking this healing path where you're willing to forgive. You're willing to. It may take a while, and doesn't mean the relationships will be back the way they automatically should be or could be. Maybe it's going to take some time. But I'm going to assume that you're kind of taking these steps. So here are some other things you can do in this healing process if you really want to try to get better. And the first one is you can kind of begin to move on. And we've been talking about that all month. In verse 14, when Jesus saw these 10 lepers, it's interesting. He didn't go to them. He didn't even touch them. Now, which is ironic because Jesus often did that. Jesus would often touch and hold other people that no one else wanted to touch or hold. But apparently he doesn't do that in this instance. He simply says to them, you go, show yourselves to the priest. Now, the reason that's important is because that's what the law required. If you were finally healed of some type of leprosy or something else, if something happened and you were healed, you first had to go get certified by the high priest or by one of the priests in the temple that to communicate to everyone else that you had indeed been healed. And so Jesus says, you go and you show yourself to the priest. And I want you to know, I believe that our gracious Lord is saying the very exact same thing to us in the midst of the hurt that we have. Many of you who have been here this whole month, you go all the way back to the first Sunday when we talked about the healing choice. The man at the pool of Bethesda, Jesus said, get up, take your mat, and walk. Go, leave your hurt behind. Start to move on. And if you've made that choice to heal, and if you've experienced comfort in pain, and if you're communicating forgiveness, then you begin to move on. Again, I confessed to you early on in this lesson, I have this tendency to kind of wallow in that pain. Maybe I'm the only one, but I have a tendency to rehearse the pain over and over again. I have this tendency to go back and pick at the scab. I go back and I think about when I was done wrong, or when someone was ugly to me, or that something in life happened and it was unfair. When God is urging all of us as His children to go. Easier said than done, but but we do this. You got to move on. You got to find someplace else to be, something else to do, something new to focus on. You got to find something new to think about. And so the first part of the process here is to say, okay, I'm gonna take a step in the right direction. Then number two, you continue to trust Jesus. Because it says in verse 14, I want you to notice, this is very interesting to me, that as they went, they were cleansed. So here's what I imagine happened. Jesus says, go show yourself to the priest. And so they all kind of look at each other. And they look at their rotting hands. And I don't know, they maybe one of them wore a veil or some type of a cover because his nose had fallen off, or maybe someone couldn't walk because all of their foot had rotted away, or they just kind of, nothing happened. They just kind of looked at each other, and apparently at some point one of the 10, I think we know who, but one of the 10 of these men having leprosy said, okay, all right, nothing's happening, but I'll do what he asked me to do. This is Jesus. There's some evidence here. There's some background. Hey, I know he's a healer. He's had compassion on us. He's spoken to us. I'll do what he asked me to do. But I imagine that in the moment, they all kind of looked at each other a little confused because they hadn't experienced anything. And so they start walking towards the city. And maybe one of them does. Then the others shrug their shoulders and say, well, okay, we'll go too. And the text says, as they did so, they were healed. As they went, they were healed. In other words, the very first steps that these men took were steps of faith. They had not yet experienced the miracle. But Jesus said, go. And so they went. And it's really not hard to imagine that the next steps they took, those next few steps they took, were steps of patient faith and trust. And Luke doesn't tell us whether or not they took 2 steps or 100 steps until suddenly they began to notice something was going on. So an amazing thing was happening. Something that they hoped for but had never experienced, at least so far. Their bodies began to be knit back together. The fallen limbs began to come back. The nose reappeared. The feet were healed. But even as they moved on, this is what I want you to see. Even as they moved on in faith and in trust, that's when the healing took place. And healing, it is a process, and it requires time. For some of us, it takes a lot of time. It takes more time for some than for others. And we've probably all been in that situation where someone's been trying to deal with a hurt, and at some point we just want to say, listen, you just need to get over it. Just snap out of it. We know, though, that that's not how it works for everybody. When I think, hey, David, you just need to snap out of it, usually what I'm doing is I'm pushing my feelings down. I'm just kind of smothering them and pushing them down and denying them and pushing them away. I mean, usually that's what I do. I'm a good Church of Christ boy. I try to ignore all that stuff. But what it says is, as they went, as you go, you experience healing. Y'all know who C.S. Lewis is, right? C.S. Lewis, great speaker and writer, wrote Mere Christianity, wrote the Chronicles of Narnia. Passed away in 1963, but he was terrorized when he was a young boy. He was terrorized by a teacher in public school. And being a Christian man, I mean, he struggled all his life to forgive this teacher and to get past the hurt that this guy had inflicted upon him. I mean, I remember back in the 70s, I had a German teacher who would throw chalk and erasers and throw metal trash cans around the room and would terrorize students who weren't paying attention. Now, again, I was a good Church of Christ kid. I always paid attention. But this was one of those kind of teachers. This guy just treated him horribly. He struggled all of his life to forgive this guy. And towards the end of his life, he wrote a letter to a friend of his in America. And this is what he said. He said, "Do you know that only a few weeks ago I realized suddenly that I had at last forgiven the cruel schoolmaster who so darkened my childhood." Who writes like this anymore, right? He said, "I'd been trying to do it for years, and like you, each time I thought I'd done it, I'd found after a week or so it had to be attempted all over again. But this time I feel sure it's the real thing." As they went, they were cleansed, moving on in trusting faith, believing as you do that healing will come. It's a powerful thing to do. David Seamands, in his book, Healing for Damaged Emotions, says this. He says, "Not only will God and His grace be with you in every..." Now, I want you to really listen to what David Seamands says here. This is important. "Not only will God and His grace be with you in every step of the healing process, but God will be pleased with you at every step of the process." Because what happens to me is when I take 2 steps forward and then I take 3 steps back in the healing process, I think somehow I've disappointed God and that He's mad at me. No. He will be happy, pleased with you at every step of the process. In the Bible, the word grace is always woven into the presence of the giver of grace. We should never use the word grace as if we were describing some kind of commodity that God dispenses. Grace means a gracious God coming to you. A loving, gracious God accepts us as we are, offers Himself lovingly to us right here and now, not when we shape up. He continues, God is as pleased with you when you're in this healing process as loving parents are when their child starts learning to walk. And I'm so very much familiar with that now because Caleb is walking and he's learning to walk. And he stumbles around and he falls down and his daddy does not say to him, "You little idiot, can't you do anything right?" His mama doesn't chastise him because he falls down. And I'll guarantee his grandparents don't. Pick him up. Set him aright. Get him going again. The child stumbles. They're excited. These are exciting days in a home. The child stumbles, knocks over the furniture, may even bend the lamp a bit. But do the parents scold him, tell him they're displeased with him or that he's not doing a perfect job? Does dad shout, "You ought to be better than that kid"? Of course not. God will be pleased with you every step of the way. And I'll tell you this, even if you never, ever get there to complete what you feel like is complete healing, God will still be pleased with you. So you begin to move on. I'm done. Keep trusting Jesus. But then I think a third thing is really important. You've got to discover some ways to express gratitude. One of them, when he saw he was healed, came back praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked Him. And he was a Samaritan. Now that's in Luke, this is the point, that it was a Samaritan who did this. You need to think of whoever the biggest enemies are of America, that kind of a person's being held up as the example of the way you should be. And that everybody else is being held up as the example of the way you shouldn't be. But that's a different sermon. So on their way, they see that their arms and their hands, their feet, and their noses and their ears and everything else was being hit, that the lesions were going away. And one of them stopped in his tracks, and he turns around, and he frantically makes his way back to Jesus, and he sprawls in the dust at Jesus' feet, and he began to mingle his tears with the dust, and he's grabbing the feet of Jesus, and he's thanking Him for what He's done. Only 1 out of the 10 displays this gratitude. Now, like I said, I could do a lot of preachifying here, but I'll just exercise some restraint and say, if you're going to fully experience healing in your life, you're going to have to find some things to be thankful for. You're going to have to find a way to express some gratitude to God. There's lots of ways to do that. I'm not going to tell you exactly how to do it, but you begin to move on, you continue to trust Jesus, and then you find some reasons for being grateful. Here's a great starting point. Here's a prayer. It's not on the screen, but I'll just say the words to you. I think this is important. You can say, "Lord, thank you for healing me on your perfect schedule." Just be thankful for that. Lord, thank you. I don't see it yet. It isn't happening exactly right now, but I know you've got a schedule. So thank you, Lord, for healing me according to your perfect schedule. Can you just pray that prayer? Now, I know don't misunderstand me, please. And I'm always afraid in something like this that this is not 4 easy steps to be healed from your emotional hurts. That's not what this is. These are some suggestions. These are some helpful things that I think from the text of Scripture that can help us move in a better direction. But right now, and I think you ought to be praying, and right now we're going to spend some time in prayer. We're going to play picture's going to come up, and behind the picture, inserted into the picture, there's a song called Gentle Shepherd that's going to play. It's some guys singing this song. I want you to listen. Gentle Shepherd, come and heal. The words are there. If you want to sing, you can. But I really want you to spend some time in prayer as well. You don't have to bow your head to pray. You can just kind of look at the words and let this song minister to you in the next few minutes.
Gentle Shepherd, come and feed us, for we need your strength from day to day. There's no other we can turn to, who can help us face another day. Gentle Shepherd, come and lead us, for we need you to help us find our way. There's no other we can turn to, who can help us face another day. Gentle Shepherd, come and lead us, for we need you to help us find our way.
Give me the heart of a servant, tender and faithful and true. Fill me with love and use me, O Lord, so that the world can see you. Give me the heart of a servant, tender and faithful and true. Fill me with love and use me, O Lord, so that the world can see you.